for a lovely introduction, and I'd like to thank everyone here for such a wonderful welcome in Goiânia. It's a beautiful city, and I've really enjoyed. That would make it easier to understand myself. Oh, English. Okay. There's been some really very interesting debates and discussions going on in the last 2 days. And so I'm hoping that what I'm going to present to you today will lead on from some key ideas that we've seen emerging from the discussion. As was introduced, I'm a professor at Plymouth University, where I teach Digital Art and Technology MRes, and Digital Art and Technology, and Digital Media and Animation. And I'm also an artist originally, so I come from a contemporary arts background, so that gives you some idea of my approach and my interests and what's important to how I think about technology. I then went on to do a master's as well at Plymouth University, so I have an MRes Digital Art and Technology, and then followed there with my PhD with trans-technology research. So a little bit of an idea of where my process to get to this point. So the context of my research is interdisciplinary. TransTech Research Group is a group of scholars from many different areas, many different disciplines. So we have historians, anthropologists, artists, designers, and what this allows us to do is look at technology from many different perspectives, from a range of perspectives. I'm using this to contextualize what I'm going to talk about, so to give you a sense that it's a more general approach from the team that I work with. So TransTech is led from a historical and theoretical perspective. Its key concern is to understand how the meaning of a technology is constructed through human agency and imagination, and how it is interpreted in the public domain. This means that we are interested in unearthing evidence of human desire, socio-economic and cultural imperatives, as well as philosophical aspects, as they are manifested in the way that technology is invented, innovated, and interpreted by its users. Just some quick information about the research group. So we've had 1.9 million in funding in euros from the last 8 years now, and there's a range of projects that we're working on with scholars across Europe, and we also have people coming from Portugal and Brazil researching with us. So we have a key approach to this, which is a particular way of thinking about technology, and that is that they're dynamic. Okay, that the results of a range of forces. So it's a very anti-determinist way of thinking about technologies. We understand that they're material, but we also understand that the meaning of a technology emerges from the way in which people use it, the way in which people experiment with it, or the social ways that technologies are used, as well as the ideas and the concepts that engineers and inventors the ideas that drive invention as well. So there's this whole range, this whole network of different things that lead to the eventual forms, the rarefied forms that different media and other technologies take. So the reason that I'm saying this is that within my own work, I'm trying to unpack a certain set of technologies. And these are biofeedback sensors, biosignal sensing. And the reason that I'm interested in doing this is because I think that it's very important that artists and technologists working with these types of technology don't import the concepts from other disciplines which use these sensors. Okay? I'll talk about this a bit more. So, what I'm really interested in is how we understand ourselves, how we understand our own bodies, how we use technology to measure our state, to tell us whether we were healthy or sick, okay? To tell us what, to give us a sense of our organs and how they work, okay? So this self-perception is what I'm really interested in. And there's many things that affect and form our self-perception. And one of those are the concepts that we take from medicine, from sports, these different areas. And what I believe is that different ideas are reinforced by the technologies that we use to experience and to see our bodies. And so this idea and this problem was introduced by Regine Spitz yesterday, where she talked about, very briefly, an example of a broom being introduced to a tribe of people, and how they didn't have dust, okay, they had no concept of dust, and then somebody gave them a broom, and they started to use the broom to sweep up dust. And suddenly they needed to clean spaces. There was a concept of a ground that needed to be cleaned, okay? So what I'm thinking about is how tools reinforce certain phenomena. They give shape to phenomena. So, and one of these forms is, one of these tools is biofeedback technology. So the phenomena that we experience ourselves are brought to us by what, for instance, this technology, but many, many others. So there's three sets of three things that I want to talk about in this context. The first is the idea of interdisciplinarity and the logics that we give in order to make sense of our work as artists using technologies. The second are the logics of instrumentation in arts practice. Now, arts practitioners use biofeedback technology and have done since the 1970s for a range of different ways of controlling media, or for the sonification or visualization of data from the human body. There's a number of different ways in which we can make sense of this activity as an artistic practice. But often the way that artists talk about this activity is as if they are allowing or using the technology to access a real body, an objective body, okay? A body that is already fixed and decided, okay? And what I'm trying to unearth in my work is a way of thinking about using technologies to create bodies, to produce them, okay? So the last thing I'm going to talk about is some ways of getting out of the black box. So the black box is a computing and engineering term, but it's also used by Bruno Latour to talk about technologies that we use, but we don't think about what's happening inside them. You know, you put one thing in one side of the black box and something else comes out of the other side, and we don't think about what's happening inside the box, okay? And I think that as artists using sensors, we need to open up the box. We need to look inside. We need to make a mess of things. We need to ask questions about what it is and what we're reinforcing, what concepts are attached to the sensors that we use. So I'm very briefly going to go over this because I've spent a lot of time contextualizing rather than talking about specifics. But in interdisciplinary research, there's, or the way in which interdisciplinary research is understood, there's a number of different ways that we can logically analyze its value and what it gives to us, what it provides for us. The first of these is a concept of accountability. So when an artist goes and works with us in a science lab, one of the things that we can say that they provide is a concept of the impact of that scientific research outside of the lab, okay, in the wider world. Okay, so the artist is like a proxy for an everyday person, okay, and they come in and they bring a conscience. So that's the first logic. It's a very important role. The second logic is that of innovation. this is an idea that Stephen Wilson talked about a lot. And he really explored the idea that artists, when they work with technologies or when they work in the sciences, they have a different view. They're more iconoclastic, they're more exciting, they're more... they don't have the same preconceptions that technologists have. They're different, they're wild, they're crazy, okay? They think that communication is important, they think that wonder is important, okay? And this, what Wilson says about this, is that artists participating in research teams could add a perspective that could help drive the research process. If the culture had to rely only on traditional lines of research, we might have had to wait much longer for the developments that have profoundly shaped the last decades. So Wilson's really pointing at things like artist placement group and the contributions that artists have made to things like computing, these kind of activities. But part of this justification for artists working with technology and sciences is economic. So even Wilson talks about the invisible hand of the marketplace, the fact that if we overlook the possible, strange and interesting contributions that artists can make to technology, then we'll lose something that's economically valuable. Now, I don't want to downplay the value of innovation for economic reasons. It is very important. But this, as a justification for arts practice, is extrinsic. It's external to the reason why we want to make art and why we want to use technology and science in art making. So I think there's another reason why what we're doing is important. Okay. So these are some of Wilson's reasons. Artists are good communicators. So, okay, artists are very useful to help researchers communicate their work. I mean, it's an instrumental use of artists' skills. So the final logic is the logic of ontology. Okay, it's the idea that artists have differing ontologies, and this is a kind of for me, an idea that I'm kind of exploring in my thoughts at the moment. So, what Bourne and Barry say about this is that artists can affect ontological change in the objects of research and the relation between research subjects and objects. And what I mean about objects is things like the body. Okay? So if I go and work with a scientist using sensor technologies, and we have an object, heart rate, that we're interested in, then there's a question about whether I'm just taking their concept of heart rate that's defined by a need in medicine or in sports or physiology, or if I take that on rather than thinking about what the heart means to me, or whether the heart is really a thing that I have any interest in. These are very kind of important things. So artists can think about these things differently. We can have a very different concept of the body. So a nice example of this is, I think, of a kind of two dual approaches to art science collaboration. There's these two projects. So this man, Adam Zaretsky, has a really wonderful manifesto. He's a transgenic artist, and he works with the concept of transgenics and also with genetically modified organisms and activities and practices like gene sampling. And Zaretsky's way of looking at this practice is as that he has an important role as an artist to look at these things from a more aesthetic point of view. Okay, and he says, I'll read from what he says. Scientific and industrial organisms created for specific utilization or for the furtherance of comprehension are also expressions of aesthetic choices. This is why I feel it's my duty as an artist to learn these technologies. So he's saying that there's always an aesthetic underlying what we do in the sciences. New reproductive strategies are opening the doors to rapid evolutionary trends, nationalised, racialised, popular and corporate. Are there more aesthetic organisms? The lack of a common global aesthetic and a historical track record of bad taste, i.e. ethnic cleansing, line dancing, liposuction, and most painting, provides me with the impetus, the eclectic fecundity to guarantee iconoclasm in a situation which could all too easily lead to the erasure of the same. This is the impediment and the allure that epitomises the crossroad between biology and the arts. So he's very motivated by the idea that he can bring something very different to this practice, and he says that it's very important that artists are involved in adding something to the aesthetics of these activities. So what he's doing is now teaching people from outside of the sciences to use these technologies. But one of the things that he does with the students is gets them to deal with the meaning of what they're doing. So when they produce, when they work with pheasant embryos, for example, they have to decide how they're going to kill the embryos when they've finished working with them. Okay. Now usually they're just washed down the sink in the lab. They're not considered a living object. But instead, Zaretsky asks his students to consider what they're going to do. So some of them produce killing rituals of different kinds. They give them particular drugs, or they destroy them in particular ways. Some people just throw them away because they don't feel it's important. But there's an interaction with the meaning within the lab of these objects, what they are to different people in different places. There's another project. It's a very complex area because there's a lot of ways to interpret the activities in these artists. So Oren Katz and Einet Zur from Symbiotica Research Lab at the University of Western Australia. They run a tissue culture and art project. And what they've been doing is these two very interesting projects where they produce victimless leather. So this is a tiny leather jacket. It's very, very difficult to grow these cell cultures over a particular size. So their work is very small. And they also did a project called Disembodied Cuisine, where they grew a tiny steak from frog muscle tissue. And throughout the course of the exhibition, people would come and eat tiny pieces of the frog muscle. And it was consumed during this process. And one of the things that I wonder about with this project is what the concept of meat is. What's the concept of eating that underlies this activity? Because these victimless foods are things that have never lived. So if you are somebody who buys their food in a supermarket and your meat is in a little tray, and you know this clean little tray, this lump of material, this lump of matter, then this is a way in which our idea of what eating is moves away from a world where creatures look at the sun and live and walk and feel pain and love and have babies and die and eat leaves, and this complex world of organisms who have an energy that we consume in some way. There's an interaction, a very fundamental interaction with nature, with consumption, and I'm sure there's many religious and cultural precedents for different ways of thinking about what we absorb when we consume food. And yet we can argue that what Katz and Zur are doing is providing us with a fantastic technology, okay? You know, something that will prevent suffering, because these things have never lived, truly, or they're semi-living, is the concept. But the question of whether or not they're food or meat, or what meat is, I mean, that's a great site to ask this question, maybe. I think that's really problematic, because we have imported, in thinking that this solves a particular problem, we've already imported an industrialized concept of what food is, okay? And with that, we may leave out some very important things that connect how we think about our bodies and the natural world. Okay. There's also another aspect to this work, which I think is important, and it's something that Simon Perry's an American artist and theorist. Actually, yeah, you're right. But he's in America, at ACE, yes, sorry. He is an Australian artist and theorist, excuse me. And I think his writing is something that I really, really love, because he takes a very, very critical but very informed view of many of these debates and about artists working with technology. And one of the things that Perry says is that we need to worry about consumer technologies. So when we're being innovative, we need to question the consumer technologies that we make use of. They're really, really convenient. I mean, I'm a hypocrite because I'm here using my laptop and this projector and all these things. But if we want to do something that's genuinely creative, then we need to kind of look inside these things. We need to question them a little more. And so there's a constant need to retrain for artists who are using these devices. But another thing that he points out is that work like these kind of projects using scientific devices to make artwork what was his insight? These kind of projects domesticate the science. So the artists come along and they take a very frightening science, transgenics, cell culture. It's weird, okay? And they bring it into the art gallery and they make it something that we can approach and that we can say, oh, well, this isn't so bad. It looks kind of cool, okay? So they're domesticating sciences that perhaps we want to have more conversation about. And I do think that their projects really do bring the science to a place where it is culturally questionable, where the audience can question it and think about it. So it's good what they're doing to open up these dialogues. So I'm going to talk now about biofeedback, finally, which is the technology that I've been working with and trying to think about in this way, in this kind of troubling way. Biofeedback and biosignaling technologies measure the vital signs in the human body. Okay, they're used for this purpose. And they have applications in many, many different areas. And biofeedback is originally a clinical practice which is where biosignals are presented to the subject. So you put a heart rate monitor on someone and you show them an image. You can show them a graph or something that shows how their heart rate is changing in real time. So it gives you a real-time access to your own body. This is quite an interesting concept. And of course it's really interesting for artists working with performance. Okay. So it's one of the main concepts in biofeedback is that there are certain physiological signals that we can't access consciously. So we're being put in touch with the body by technologies. The technology is giving us a really nice link to something that's real in our bodies that otherwise we couldn't feel, we couldn't know about. And one of the goals with clinical biofeedback therapy is to give people to teach people how to change their bodily states, their physiological states. This is biosignaling more generally. So this set of sensors are also used for medical monitoring in hospital, military and space applications. Human-computer interfacing, so this is kind of what we're interested in. This is where my research proceeds from originally. So interactive art, games, affective computing, interfaces for disabilities, and brain-computer interfaces. So neurofeedback is used, is brain-based feedback. So the clinical biofeedback is there's lots of different things that people do. So there's something called bruxism, which is where you have a lot of tension in your jaw. So people, if you have muscle feedback, you can see the tension, you can learn to relax, you can look at the computer screen and get a kind of access to that feeling. And patients then go through a course of learning how to relax. There's lots of different ways it's used. And there's lots of different sensors as well. So TLAs, that's 3-letter acronyms. It's a good acronym. So we have the Electromyogram, that's muscles. EEG, the brainwave signal. ECG or EKG, the heart muscle. Okay, that's the electrical signal that causes the heart to beat. Galvanic skin response, which I think is a really, really interesting signal, and that's it's the conductivity of your skin, and it's actually your autonomic nervous system, which is a fight or flight response that causes your skin to change. So your glands open, you begin to sweat, and it's been a very, very difficult measure to use because the skin is this huge organ and it does lots of things, and it's very responsive to emotion and to different contexts. And it really varies depending on where you put the sensor on people and from one place to another. So, I mean, here, because the air is very dry, I was doing some tests. I've got these fish. I'll maybe hand some out. There's no sweat. There's no sweat coming off the skin, so you have a very different sense of this measure. Okay, so if we were using GSR now, it would be very different to some other country. If I was in Plymouth, for instance, we'd have to really change how we the settings for the measurement. Anyway, I'm rambling. Sorry. We also have respiration as well. So you can tie it's really, really simple. You tie an elastic band around your chest. You have a stretch measure on that measures the change in conductivity, and then when you breathe in and out, you have a changing signal. So some of these technologies are actually much simpler than we might think. So it's an interesting time to be thinking about these technologies because they're suddenly coming into the market as devices that can be bought for consumer applications. And there's lots of different, I guess some of you must have seen these things, NeuroSkies, the MindFlex, the X-Wave, all these things that are used for games often. Most of the time, the NeuroSkies system measures attention, meditation, and eye blinks. Now, eye blinks are really, really hard to remove when you're measuring a very, very small signal from the brain. But you have these huge muscle movements going on in the face. So the eye blinks kind of start to take over as an important measure. And actually, I don't see why eye blinks aren't as interesting as they're controlled by the brain. They mean lots of things. There's lots of meaning. So anyway, we have these devices. They're also meditation games and these kind of things that are used. It's an interesting time to be thinking about these things. There's also self-quantification, which I think is interesting. So a lot of people using smartphones are recording all of their activities, their steps, what they eat, okay, how many hours they sleep for. So there are a lot of people quantifying their bodies using a whole range of different instruments. Okay. So artists have been using these technologies for a long time. In the 70s, we have Alvin Lucia's work, David Rosenboom. These projects, or various performances, which use things like EEG sensing or heart rate sensing to control synthesis, musical synthesis, often controlling an oscillator, or sending control data to something like a synthesizer, so like a Moog synth was used by Richard Titelbaum in his 1967 spacecraft. So we also have Peretti's piece, Amygdala, 2005, where he controlled media sets. So people would have playback of films, or people use the data to synthesize media. So I spent some time working with biofeedback machinery, and one of the first performances that I did, we were working with, this is before the instruments became very cheap, but I was working with a biofeedback sensor built by a Dutch company called Nexus 10, and we still use these now at Plymouth. But I did a project in Turkey with a workshop with a group of students. This is when I was a student, and we had this whole range of sensors, and I needed to do a performance for the end of the workshop, but I couldn't think what was interesting about these sensors, what was coming from them. Okay, I couldn't think what it was I wanted to say as an artist about the content of these, or the concepts that they included. And so we did a performance called, there was an uncontrolled experiment where we set up a number of experiments, but they were nonsense experiments. They were things that you shouldn't be able to sense using sensors. Okay. So what we did was we got one of the researchers to stand with his back to the room, sensors, all the different sensors on, and we had them visualized here just using a simple PDGEM, pure data patch, and an oscillator. So we could all hear and sort of see this collection of sensors changing, and his biosignals changing. And we got him to stand with his back to the room, and everyone in the room stood and pointed at him and concentrated. And it was a few years of thinking. I kind of thought this was a funny throwaway thing, you know. What is it? Do we really believe that someone can sense that people are pointing at them? What changes? Is there a change in the body? Could we sense this kind of this psychic knowledge? Is there something we can read from this? And I was really unsure about what it was I wanted to say with this performance. And after a while, it became clear to me that really the question that I wanted to raise, or the thing that was important, was that I wasn't sure what these measures really meant to me as an artist. Okay, it was like I was interested in more messy things, more human things, perhaps. So, I mean, there's some other projects that I've done, and I did using these sensors. This is a performance system that makes use of a whole range of sensor types, mixing them together, and you have two people plugged into the system, and it synthesizes audio and visuals. So there's a screenshot from there. But they're really nice things to use. They're great interfaces. But the philosophy wasn't there for me. The concept wasn't there. I wasn't sure what they really meant. And I think it's because what you get when you read the body through these instruments is a line of numbers. It's a string of numbers. And I wasn't happy with this, because it's a string of numbers that attach to a particular measure, but it's a measure that's been invented by someone else for another purpose. Okay, it's not my instrument. So I'm going to run. I'm going over time, aren't I? How long have I got? Does anyone know? Okay, cool. All right. I'll speed up. I'll start dancing. Right. So there are some. There are particular, looking at biofeedback technology and how it's used, there's particular ideas that artists use in order to make sense of their work. In the same way that we make sense of interdisciplinary practice. So the first logic is that it puts the mind in connection with the body, and it gives us a representation of inaccessible body states. Okay, so that's the logic of biofeedback, that we get in touch with something. It's useful for these reasons. The second reason is that it undoes the disembodiment of virtual media, okay, of immersive media. So we have this idea that virtual reality technologies and technology more generally, if you look at the philosophy of Albert Borgman, technology usually distances us from the body, that's the concept, but here the biofeedback technology puts us back in touch with it. Excuse me. Right. But the final logic that I think is interesting is that if we look at the philosophy of science, the sociology of science, and look at the way in which instruments come into being, if we look at their history, then actually we can see that instruments are co-constructed by their users, that instruments can be very, very messy before they become the nice, fixed, tidy measures with their lines of numbers. And that actually there's a poetic opportunity to innovate with them prior to this, and therefore to innovate on what we think of and what we experience as the body. So instead of being put in touch with a pre-decided real body, okay, an objective body that, for instance, biomedicine has produced for us, instead, perhaps we should be inventing our own measures, our own technologies, our own interfaces, in order to manifest things that we're interested in as artists. Because otherwise we're adopting the paradigms of other disciplines. It's useful, and I'm not sure that we shouldn't say that we shouldn't use these technologies, but I think we might be missing a trick. We might be missing an opportunity. So the first logic, we have, this is from the IBVA website, which is a neurofeedback piece of equipment that's marketed for artists in the UK. They say biofeedback is a training process of using technology to provide you with more information about what your body is doing than your ordinary senses provide. This feedback helps you to learn your mind, learn to use your mind to develop greater control over your body, or in the case of neurofeedback, your brain. Okay. Now this idea is actually very dated, okay, or reinforces some very dated ideas that it doesn't question any of these objects. So what your body is doing, okay, your body is doing something, but your mind doesn't know what it's doing, okay? So we have this kind of Cartesian idea that we're not experiencing the body as it really is, that we, somehow our minds aren't really fundamentally part of the organism that we are. And the idea that machines are better than us at knowing the world is a concept that comes from 18th century science and has really influenced the thought of many people who worked with instrumentation. So here we have Lewis, who he built this device, for example, polygraph, and he recorded fetal heart rate in 1913, so an early physiologist innovating with these devices. But he says, the way that he describes what these machines do is, he says, the records in themselves constitute the most exact signs of cardiac affections which we possess. Imprinted by the disease itself, they form a permanent and unquestionable testimony of the events which occurred. Okay? So the machine gives us an unquestionable record of the exact signs, okay? It's the best thing. So in this ontology, Lewis gives us a sense that really there's a world out there that we don't access with our minds, but we can solve this problem using instrumentation. And this has been a problem for the sciences for a very, very long time. I mean, Francis Bacon in the 70s, I think his 1620 new organum, new instrument, talks about this problem of of not being able to know what's really there. Okay, so it's been a real issue. But the concept of mechanical objectivity is a positivist position in terms of what's out there and what machines do, okay? The machines give us the world, they give us the reality, we don't know what it is. And it was a very popular idea in 17th century, 17th and 18th century Europe. It was actually one form of objectivity that has fallen away in many areas of science. Now many scientists, there's other concepts like trained judgment, the idea that you have a trained knowledge of an ability to interpret the materials that you get from instrumental measurement. So, but we still think of these machines as having a special quality. So as Latour and Woolgar talk about instruments in scientific laboratories in their work, they say the use of certain pieces of apparatus makes it easy to get the impression that substances directly provide their own signatures. So things in the world can tell us what they are using these devices. So I think that to think of these technologies as giving us an access to a real body is a mistake. As creative people working with these technologies, we should always keep in mind our ability to create new ways of feeling and experiencing. Okay? The second logic that we come across is using in biofeedback is this re-embodiment, this relinking with reality. It's very similar to the notion of mechanical objectivity, but it's more disciplinary specific, because we're talking about the effects of digital media already. So there's this, but it follows the same logic really, that there's a real body, and then we get so involved in immersive media that we forget about it, it gets left behind. But if we have an interface that instead of being symbolic, it uses physiological measures, then we can bring the body back in again. It's a nice thought, but it doesn't solve this same problem of how we conceptualize the instrument. So Shah Davies' work is a really nice example of this. So in the 90s she made these wonderful immersive environments and used respiration sensors in order to allow people using heads-up displays or to move through the world that she'd created, the virtual environment that she'd created. And what this does is it gives people, the concept of using a respiration sensor for this is that it allows people to really emotionally connect, is the idea, with the experience of moving around rather than using a kind of joystick or something else. You move through the environment purposefully. So she says that it brings the experience inwards, grounding it within the core of the participant's physical body, conceptually informed by the scuba diver's practice of buoyancy control. This hands-off technique frees participants from the urge to handle and control the world of objects. This approach was intended to reaffirm the role of the subjectively experienced, felt body in cyberspace, in direct contrast to its usual absence or objectification in virtual worlds. The use of breathing and balance also tends to deeply relax people, creating a tranquil state of mind and body. George Cutt as well, his work has used biosignaling in many different contexts. He says that, here we go. So he says that interactive practices reframe subjectivity as a fundamentally active process, shifting our sense of involvement in the issues at hand from detached onlookers to active participants. Each of the works creates a space where participants and observers alike can become present to aspects of body. So our final logic is that of instruments as a reified theory, okay? So when we produce them, when we work with them, then actually they're open to our own interpretation. So we can move away from these realist views of instruments as objective measurements and actually start thinking of them as things that emerge through a process of change, dynamic change, okay, dynamic innovation. And there's a number of ways that in my own research I've looked at this, I've started to think about this. The first of and these are my kind of three arguments really about this that I think are, there's a lot of kind of ideas I think that can help us to start opening the black box, to start thinking differently. So the body is configured by and configures devices. Okay, this is really important, I think. The second is that symbol and meaning should be a valid aspect of accounts of sensing. So sensors don't make sense outside of an understanding of the protocols or the situation or the scenario that they are used in. Okay, so there's a strong. I'll explain this a little more. The third is that poetics is a useful way for us to think about a useful solution for thinking about making the world. Okay. We make the body, if we make instruments, then we make the body in a particular way. We reinforce the phenomena that we feel. So, in my own work, to kind of follow on from this original point of view where I was working with biofeedback sensors, but there's just something missing from the practice. I felt like I was using someone else's idea, and that it wasn't my view of the world, that it wasn't individual, okay? And it wasn't fundamentally creative, I think. We can create media, but can we fundamentally create things in the world by changing how we experience them? And it seems that biofeedback offers us this access to something that's really fundamental, so why can't we really innovate on it? So I started looking at a number of different scholarly research areas, anthropology, history, sociology of medicine, to start thinking about how we can understand the way that the technologies that we use change our bodies. And there's a whole load of different people who've looked at the history of medicine or anthropology of medicine who argue that there is a lot more complex things going on. So I'll talk about a couple of these. So the pulse, for example, wasn't taken, but it was felt. So Shigeisa Kuriyama, who's a medical historian, has done a really nice comparative study of Western and Greek medicine compared with Chinese medicine. And historically, even in Greek medicine as well, the human pulse was not measured by counting. And it's actually, historically speaking, crazy to measure the pulse by counting. Okay. So, Galen's treatise on reading the human pulse, used these wonderful poetic descriptions of what the pulse was doing. It would be worming or gazelling, okay? So you put your hand on you're measuring the pulse.